My name's Michelle Snyder. I'm one of the consultants here at the Center for Healthy Churches. I lead our nonprofit arm of the work, which is called CHC-PneuMatrix, and I'm also the team lead for our organizational development work, which pretty much means helping churches be their best selves in all kinds of ways. We're glad you're joining us for this series that we're calling The Future Ready Church, taking a deep dive into what it looks like for the church to tackle some strategic questions, helping the church be what's needed for the world today. So with me, I have some of my esteemed colleagues who are experts at what we're talking about, which for this episode is called Developing the Habit of Discernment. Basically, today we're talking about the sort of foundational starting point of any discernment, of any search process, any visioning process that needs to be discernment. So I would like to welcome with us Jayne Davis. Jayne is a Baptist pastor, cooperative Baptist pastor in Wilmington, North Carolina, which I hear is having a major heat wave these days. Are you
a little toasty? Yes.
roasting? Yeah. Jayne, what do you do at the church? What's your title? Associate for?
So my role is the Minister of Spiritual Formation. So I do adult education and all of our spiritual formation retreats and prayer initiatives and all of that.
Okay, super. She also is a world traveler and most recently returned from where?
The Maldives. Yes.
The Maldives. So, yeah.
It was highly restful and contemplative, I will say.
Speaking of discernment, right?
There you go.
Also, I would like to introduce BJ Woodworth. BJ is a Presbyterian pastor in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he works at East Liberty Presbyterian Church as their, what, BJ? What's your title?
Oh, it's gotten really long these days. Started out as the director of spiritual life ministries, very similar to Jayne. But we've been in about a 2.5 year period of transition. So I'm overseeing a lot of the transition realities, both bringing in a new pastor and then kind of helping him as we now seek to hire an associate pastor. So lots of discernment happening
Speaking of
in the
discernment.
context.
Yeah. BJ also runs the Taizé service at the church and does spiritual direction individually with people. He's a former church planter, coach, spiritual director, also a good friend of mine. I will say, those of you who are watching don't know this, but it has been like one of my bucket list items to get Jayne and BJ in the same room. They are both gurus of the Enneagram and discernment, so I'm glad to be here with them. And then, of course, we have Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson is the original founder of the Center for Healthy Churches, longtime cooperative Baptist pastor, much experience, probably more than anybody on our whole team in terms of companioning churches of all shapes and sizes through the discerning work of visioning and strategic planning. Bill is also a master gardener, and I don't know, he might be a mediocre golfer, but he golfs a lot. So we might say master gardener and golfer. So welcome to our panelists. And like I said, we're here to talk about discernment. So my first question here is, let me name that this is the first episode of our series. So we're going to do 6 episodes in this series. This is the very first one that we're doing, which might suggest, and I hope it does, that all visioning process needs to start with discernment, that all visioning is discernment. And the first place we start is discernment. And so I just want to foundationally see, BJ, if you can talk a little bit about what it means when we say discernment and why it's so important.
Yeah. I remember a really long time ago, I think I was actually a college student at a conference hearing that in Romans 12:1-2, discern the will of God, that passage, that the word discern in the Greek means to sift, like a flour sifter. So I'm quoting a talk. I cannot speak the details of the Greek in that, but I love that image of what it means to discern. And so to me, discernment is really about listening. I think in the context that we're talking about it, listening to the congregation, listening to what's happening in the neighborhood around the congregation, and perhaps primarily listening to the Spirit and how God might want to lead the church, kind of bringing in what's happening in the church, what's happening in the neighborhood, the direct missional context, And obviously, hopefully, Spirit is kind of overseeing all of that listening. So trying to create space for the people of God to listen for guidance, direction. Again, I like that image of the flour sifter sifting through what's good, what's not good, wisdom, how the Spirit might be leading, guiding, and directing a group of people.
And Spirit hovering over the water. And
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Bringing order to the chaos. Yeah, maybe that's another good image. Trying to awaken and align with what Spirit's doing to bring order to chaos, because transition, strategic planning times can be very chaotic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. When it's good chaos and bad chaos.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So Jayne, can you talk a little bit, like I hear what BJ is saying, and he's saying things like listening, that's kind of what he said. And listening can be a task, right? You can assign me the task of listening. I think that's not what he's saying, that sort of listening as a task. How can you help think through or talk through like the ways in which we're not so much talking about a task, but about like a muscle that gets developed?
Yeah. I mean, I think, we're individually as congregations, we're on a journey with God and we're developing this relationship with God. And it's this ongoing relationship of listening, not simply, okay, it's meeting one of the vision process. Let's discern now what's happening rather than, or more of a, just a way of being in our congregations. Are we inviting our folks at all times to be curious about what they're noticing? Or do we expect God to be present? Do we expect God to be at work? Do we expect God to be inviting us into what God is doing? And if we believe that, then all along the way, we're trying to equip people to notice, what do you notice happening, as BJ was saying, in our community or in our congregation, or what's something that someone said in our congregation recently that has really just kind of stuck with you and seems to be taking root? How are we paying attention? I always think about, Moses and the burning bush, and it's not until Moses gets curious and that he hears anything from God. We can just, we're moving so much, we're so busy. We don't always create the space or the rest to be able to listen and to pay attention. And so it is a mindset, a muscle, an ongoing way of hearing and practicing what we hear. And, sometimes we hear well, sometimes we don't hear well, and learning what is of God and what, is just kind of a lot of noise around us.
Yeah, one of the things I think I've heard BJ talk about a lot is both challenging as we think about doing this work, and opportunity if you're a pastor listening to this podcast, but a church that isn't practiced at it, that hasn't developed these muscles, they sit down and say, okay, it's time to do strategic planning. Let's discern. And oftentimes it means praying before we start, or that's what they mean when they say we're going to discern. Well, first we invite God to come in our midst. And what I hear the two of you really naming is this is not a switch you flip on as soon as you decide you're going to do visioning work. This is like a muscle that gets built over time and is part of a culture. And if it isn't, you really need to get started on that now, visioning process or no visioning process. Is that a fair reflection back of?
I think culture is a great word, creating a culture of discernment, because it comes from all places and all people at different times. We don't, put God on our time schedule. Okay, God, it's spring. We got to do visioning now. So let's turn up the volume a little bit. It's hopefully the visioning process is all that we've been hearing all along. We kind of get to put out on the table and go, okay, what does all of this mean? What are we, how do all these pieces fit together? What is really the rising to the top?
So in some ways, if we've been discerning all along, visioning is sort of pulling all the things out of our pockets that we've been collecting and laying it all out and saying, what does this mean we've been hearing? Interesting.
What is God calling us to do with this now?
That's very different than I think we often think about. Yeah. So Bill, this question is for you as the person who really created the Center for Healthy Churches visioning process and has done most of this with congregations. One of the things you talk about in our process, I hear you name, is this thing you call holy indifference. And that seems like it's in the discernment space. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you mean when you say that to churches.
Yeah, happy to, because it's often the idea that is least likely to be present in the initial stages, that we come to this process with a lot of agendas and a lot of preconceived ideas and plans and notions, and to get people to lay down what they bring to the table and to truly listen, to be curious. I love that. I often say, BJ, it's the same root word discern as discover. And so are you interested in discovering? Are you curious enough to discover? You just want to tell us what you want to do, and then we can do it. And it's certainly not original with us. I think Ruth Haley Barton's the one who introduced me to it years ago. Ignatius of Loyola is the one who actually coined the phrase in the 16th century. The notion that as we grow more and more focused on the divine agenda, or God's dream for our church, or my life, your life, we grow increasingly indifferent to our own agenda. And so as we do, then we begin to open up to the possibilities that weren't there when we were thinking about what we had in mind. And so, there's a biblical tradition. It starts with Mary in Luke 1, when the angel shows up and says, "You're going to have a baby." And she says, "How can this be?" And yet a few moments later says, "Nevertheless, let it be unto me according to your word." And then you go to Luke 21 and the other end of the book, and Jesus in the garden is faced with a similar situation. "Father, if it's possible, let this pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And so that's the same prayer, really, on both ends of the gospel. And I think it's an essential prayer that most churches are afraid to pray. To really pray, not our will, but yours be done, is to give up control and to be indifferent to our own agenda. And it's easy to say. I have a sermon on that I call the hardest prayer you'll ever pray. And it really is a challenge for most congregations who haven't had a culture of, true discernment. They've just come with a kind of consumer mentality. Here's what we want, here's what we expect. Here's what the people down the street are doing, or my cousin's church in Nashville, or whatever. And to really put all that aside and say, "Okay, God, what is your dream for our congregation?" And it has, I think it's important to say, it has to start individually. So we always say, can you pray the prayer of indifference? Not my will, but thine be done. And can we pray it? Let's pray that. Can we pray not our will? And a lot of people get a little nervous about that time, because they really didn't think they were getting into that. And if they don't get into that, then you might as well use a corporate model, because there's no difference in that and what you're going to be doing.
Yeah. I could feel myself like tensing up a little bit when you said that. I mean, that's scary stuff. Like, C.S. Lewis said, Aslan's not a tame lion. Yeah. And once you give permission to the lion to do the lion's will, who knows what's going to happen? That's right. I can hear why churches are hesitant. People are hesitant. I can also hear.
The nice thing is when they do it and they get a taste of it, they go, "This is so much better than what we did at the bank or at the school or at my office. That was boring. This is exciting." That's the difference here. The Spirit will bring it to life.
Yeah. So let me actually just keep it with Bill and say, okay, so this is great. Also, at some point, it's got to get really practical. Like I hear you saying, we need to pray this prayer. That's one really practical thing. We need to begin the process of saying out loud, "Not my will, but thine be done." What are other practical things we can do, what churches can do, that a visioning process can contain, techniques for helping us do this work of discernment? I'll ask all of you, Bill.
Well, I do think, I'll start. I think nomenclature matters. So I don't like the language of strategic planning, because it does sound corporate or whatever. So I think to stay with discernment and discovery and God's dream. I don't usually use God's will, because that gets a little funky with people as well. God's agenda. but to begin every conversation, every meeting with a collective prayer, and not to make that the perfunctory prayer at the start of the meeting, but to truly practice a kind of open, sometimes physically, open your hands, leave an open chair, candle, all those kind of things are easy to do. I'll tell a story later when we get to one session, a later conversation here about a church and a radical thing they did to really bring people to the realization all we're doing is bringing our Christmas list and hoping Santa will bring us what we want, versus opening ourselves up to something. So I think the metaphor works. I think scripture helps. I think good preaching and teaching helps in the midst of this process to remind people this is a spiritual journey. It is not simply a paint by number, spit out a magic plan that's going to change our churches. So constantly watching your language and reminding people what we're doing and what we're not doing. We're not here just to collect our want list.
Yeah, and the positive metaphors work. I'm also feeling the negatively framed metaphors. This isn't just a Christmas list. This isn't just Santa. This isn't just a vending machine. Where like those are powerful metaphors for. I hear you, for shifting the thinking. Yeah, Jayne, what?
Yeah, I was just thinking as Bill was talking, when he mentioned that opening prayer, that for our truly our prayer in this meeting, in this time, in this process, thy will be done. I heard a pastor recently talk about at the beginning of any kind of planning meeting where sort of decisions or at least next steps are on the table, they'll go around the table and ask the question, how open are you in this moment? And how dug in are you in this moment? And really truly want honest answer. If it's like, ride or die on this whatever initiative over here, and they may have their reasons for feeling strongly about it, but really inviting people into safe space to name, no, I'm not really open here, or I am. And once you say I am open, it just kind of really gives space for other people to speak new ideas. Because I think also when we have a preset, even if we don't realize it's I think this vision process is going, God may be ready to speak through some other people around the table or in the room or in the congregation. But if there's no space to hear them, if there's such a train going down the tracks, well, I'm not going to be the one to, mess that up. Clearly, they know what they're doing and will go. So, it's being willing to be honest about our own level of openness. It's creating space, and not just space, but even silence, silence in the room to give thoughts time to sink down, to give ideas or words time to bubble up. And maybe it's kind of trying not to allow it to unfold in a more corporate way where, we're just getting through this agenda and we're getting it done, but to really have a sense of expectation that if we give enough room, if we give enough space, something is going to rise up in this time. And I think stories are important. I think, how has God been at work in our midst in the past?
Good.
When has God surprised us? And it turned out so much better than we ever thought, because fear is a big derailer of discernment.
Yeah,
It's good.
Yeah, we will go to the safe and the comfortable. And theoretically, God has been like that among us, and being able to name those points in time, I think, is a helpful way to keep molding that culture.
Yeah. BJ.
I was thinking similarly. Like I think you're right, Bill. Ruth Haley Barton parses out the prayer for indifference, and then the prayer of indifference. And so I think beginning with asking the group, whatever they're working on, to begin to praying for indifference, which is already this moving towards an opening posture that both Bill and Jayne are describing. And so I think what I've been thinking about listening to you guys is like how important it is to build trust in the community. So not only are we laying down control and opening to God for God's will, another phrase that I think we can use to get away from strategic planning is, what is the mind of Christ for our church around this? I think it's either 1st or 2nd Corinthians chapter 2 it comes from. So creating space for listening. I was thinking about that while you were talking, Jayne, in the group. And we did this actually with our pastoral nominating committee at the church that I'm serving. The first meeting, I just asked them to go around and say, how do you hear God speak to you? Mm-hmm. And each person went around, and to your point, Jayne, we left 30 seconds of silence after each person shared to just hold and take in what each person said. And so we're naming how God speaks to each person, which is, I think, developing the muscle, developing the habit of discernment. It's also demystifying discernment. It's not this big woo-woo thing. We say, oh yeah, well, God communicates to me in this way, through nature or through scripture or through whatever. And you're developing not only the practice of saying, each person looking at themselves, oh yeah, I do listen. Mm-hmm. God does speak. God is still speaking. And then they're learning how to listen to each other, right? I think we can individually get to a place of indifference, but then when we come together corporately, I don't know how it is in the Baptist tradition, but in the Presbyterian tradition, we love to live up in our minds, and we're not real good at listening to one another. And that takes some practical and tactical effort to train, to teach people to listen to one another. And then to even ask after we did that, I said, what's one thing you heard that was new to you? After each person shared how God speaks to them. So I think creating space, creating community, creating safety, because I imagine you go around where you're going to hear a whole bunch of different ideas and the way in which God communicates to different people. So that's something very practical. And I think you got to keep doing that, talking about after you interview a pastor, creating 30 seconds of silence after someone shares how they think the interview went, listening to what someone else has to say is a real challenge, and something I think we need to train people in.
And takes time.
It does take time.
We're in such a rush.
That's right.
We want to get it started, get it going so we can do the new thing. But
So, BJ, can you talk a little bit about the practice you did of sending people out, like to get like something in nature? Bill Owen lights a candle, like some real concrete stuff.
Yeah, I mean, when you and I were doing that session with the church, it was spontaneous, and I remember sensing in the room that people were getting tired. They were getting information overload. And so to me, it was a form of, like what Jayne said, just intentional silence. Let's take a break, but also a space we were at a church camp. So just go out in nature, process what we've been talking about, think, be present to the Spirit, kind of prayerfully walking, and see if your attention is drawn to something that kind of captures where you think we're at in the process. And so it engages a different sense. It engages our body, it engages creativity in that space. So I think I'm steeped in the Presbyterian tradition. So anything we can do to get people out of their heads, into their bodies, into quiet, moving away from the constant chatter of these spaces, especially when you're trying to move forward at some pace, can be helpful with that. Lighting the candle, returning to a prayer. Maybe there's a fixed prayer, maybe there's a scripture that's guiding the process, again, either search process or planning process, and just regularly inserting those realities into the process. I think one that you can do throughout that helps people again know that they can listen to the movement of God is to do a regular practice of the Ignatian examen. And so just simply paying attention, even, okay, this morning, what's one thing that gave you consolation or you found energizing? Quick share around the room. What's one thing where you found desolation or was kind of discouraging to you as we met together from 9 to 12 in the first part of the day? And then you can be doing that through the whole congregation, daily or weekly. You can weave that into worship. To me, that's a practice that strengthens the individual and the corporate discernment muscles and habits.
And I love that, because how often do we really not fully hear what God might be trying to communicate to us in the present moment? But as we reflect back and
That's right.
Listen to that, things come forward.
Yeah. So do any of you have any examples of places or ways where the visioning process, one you've been a part of or have run, has been part of this kind of an ethos?
I can tell you one that I don't recommend, but it worked.
Do tell.
I was working with this church, and it was full of, and some of my best friends are engineers. So I'm not, full of very pragmatic, logical, straight line thinkers. And I would talk about this sort of thing, and they just nod and go, yeah, but when do we get started with the real stuff? Can we get past all this touchy feely business? And so one day we had a meeting. You had a 7 or 8 people in the room, and this one guy had been pressing me about when do we get to kind of lay out our ideas. And I said, okay. And I was ready for him. I said, everybody take out a pen and a paper, and you've got 5 minutes to write down all the things you think we need to do. Right? You've been waiting to unload. Let's have it. And man, they started writing, really hard, sort of like a test. And 5, 4, 3. Okay, put your pens down. Right? Okay. Everybody got their stuff. And unbeknownst to them, I brought a shredder to the meeting. And so I said, who wants to share? He pops up, I'll share, and he walks up to the front. And he has his, I said, well, let me see your paper. And I take his paper and I run it through the shredder. And, people are like, are you kidding me? And he looks at me and it is stunned. And I said, thank you. Who's next? Bring them on up here. One by one, they brought their list of things we need to do.
Wow.
Ran through the shredder. And, by the end of it, I'm thinking, we're done here. I'm going home. We're going to have to refund them whatever they paid us. And I said, what do we do now? And bless her heart, the 85-year-old lady, token super senior in the room, says, we could always ask God what he wants us to do. And I'm thinking, boom. And it changed everything.
Wow.
And so I don't recommend it. It was that moment when that visualized the fallacy of our agendas, subsuming God's agenda, and reversed it and said, look, some of those are great ideas. I have no doubt they'll come back, but they have to come back under the bigger picture of God's dream or God's, the voice of Christ, and not the voice of Bill or Sam or Sally or Joe, whatever. So for us, and that church went from thinking, a modest agenda to what I call the God-sized dream. And they did some things in their community. We talked a lot in that group about going deeper, not wider, because everybody's already exhausted. We don't need a lot of new programs. But how do you infuse depth into what you're already doing? When they changed their whole education model, they changed their discipleship model, they changed the worship model. And at first they were all worried about how do we get more young people in church, that whole bit. And I said that almost never works as an agenda item. That's a byproduct. That's not the product. And sure enough, as they began to be a more dynamic force in the community, had catalytic worship instead of perfunctory kind of stuff, participatory things, experiential, young families started showing up. And a lot of the boomerangs came back. but it all went back to, do you really want to dream big, or do you want to dream your stuff?
Mhm.
And if you want to do that, just, I can already tell you what you're going to do. It's pretty boring stuff. And so that was one of those where it worked.
Why do you not recommend it, Bill? What?
Well, I wasn't sure if he was going to walk out and quit, or if he was actually going to play ball with it. I almost think if I did it again, I'd want to set it up somehow.
Not blindside him with
but
it.
I don't know.
Sometimes that element of surprise will be the thing. Yeah.
That can be helpful.
Yeah. What about the other two? What two of you, BJ, Jayne?
One thing that
Jayne,
came
if you
to
have one.
mind. Oh, go ahead, BJ.
No, I was saying to you, go ahead.
Just one thing that came to mind, and this was just a part of this process that the church did, but we've seen prayer trios and a number of processes, but they really took both the vision casting, or the vision, I guess, listening, and the discernment out into the congregation, and just set up prayer trios and gave them some prompts to be praying about and discerning together. And then that all came back to the team. And it's a way of underscoring that, God just doesn't talk to the leadership of the church. The church is the body, and the body can listen. And it's kind of like, BJ, when you went around the table with your group, it reminds them that they too are people of prayer. They too hear God's spirit. They too can discern. And so it was just, I love that there was that broad inclusion, and also as part of that culture, that will last with that church far longer than whatever came out of this particular visioning process, was this practice of really trusting people to listen for God together, and bringing that back in.
Fruitful.
Yeah. The story that comes to mind is in the church that I had the privilege of planting. When we first started, we met in the evening, Sunday evenings, and we met in the evenings for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years. And when we first started, we were mostly young adults, no kids. And all of a sudden, 5, 6 o'clock in the evening on Sundays became like a very challenging time for infants and toddlers and parents. And we began to kind of notice, challenges around that space. And fortunately, I mean, this is the gift of church planning. We formed our whole community around 5 practices. And the first practice was listening. And it was primarily an individual practice, but basically what we did is we hosted a variety of listening sessions. Was our session at the time, our elders, and began to listen to people, of how they were experiencing in the evenings. Did they have thoughts about moving to morning time? And I remember it being hilarious to me because it's a brand new church, 6 years old. And someone literally said, well, we can't meet in the mornings. We've always met in the evenings. And I thought, oh my God, we started a new church because we didn't ever want to say that. But I particularly remember, we were a church that didn't own a building, and we were in someone's living room for this after we had listened to the congregation. And there was not agreement. Particularly some of our young adults who didn't have kids, they really wanted to stay in the evening. And I remember this, I don't know that we had the phrase back then of the prayer for indifference, but there was not unanimity or consensus, but there was unity of spirit. And I can see the face of the young adult in particular who was very adamant about leaving it in the evenings. And he said, I don't agree that we should move it to the mornings, but for the sake of the young families, I can consent, and I can sense in the room that this is what's best for the church, even though it's not what I want.
Wow.
BJ,
And-
one of the things that I think you just touched on, we should go back and say, when you formed a group with a covenant, you use that language. You say,
Yeah.
I will be willing to,
Yes.
for the sake of the unity of the body, forego my convictions even sometimes.
That's right. And
And I
there's a
think
real
that's important to say it.
there's a real subtle but powerful difference between that and voting.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I'm not against voting, right? But there's something that happens in that trying to get to unity of spirit. You can individuals can still say, I actually think this is the pastor that I would like, but because there's only 2 of us that think that, and the other 7, I sense
Right.
that that's the direction we need to move in.
That's
It's just
good.
very different. So, and then, it just shifts the way you talk about the decision that's made to the congregation and things like that. So,
Michelle, can I say one final word
Please,
about,
please do.
so church planting and working with established churches with buildings and doing strategic thinking is a kind of a different nuanced
Yep.
thing. But I do think it's helpful to, the 20th century, when you did strategic planning, you almost always got a building out of it. Why don't you? As a pastor, we knew that was kind of how you did a strategic plan. Nobody's building buildings anymore. What they're doing now is reframing how we use our buildings.
Mm.
We're building rich, people poor in most congregations. And so one of the big shifts for congregations the last 25 years especially is to rethink strategically, not how do we go wider, but how do we go deeper? And I think that's a key thing to plant early in the process, to think not so much, because many of the people on these teams are products of the post baby boom, growth surge and all that.
Right.
And they see all that as failure, where we have to help them see it as a growth of a different sort. And I think strategic thinking that's based in a kind of discernment model is very different than we're just kind of building bigger and bigger barns, because that's what we did post World War II. Well, that didn't happen unless you're a mega church, and they're not asking us to help them with discernment, or a church plant. They're the only folks doing that. And the vast majority of the people we work with are the ones who have to rethink creatively, how do we better utilize this resource of a building so that it's not just a day and a half a week that somebody's in here. So,
Yeah. Well, good conversation, good word. I have much to learn about discernment, as I suspect many who are listening to us today do. So thank you to our panelists for your time today. Also, thank you to our listeners for your time today. We're grateful for the opportunity to think with you about the things that occupy your days as well as ours, which is trying to discern God's call for the church in the most effective way possible. We hope that you've heard some we hope you've heard some insights and advice that have been helpful to you. At the Center for Healthy Churches, we love it when folks like you call and ask us to journey with you through these processes of discernment. As you can see, we've got some consultants who are deep wells of expertise and who are really good at what they do. So if you need any assistance with long-range planning or discernment work or visioning, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at our website, which is chchurches.org. Thanks and have a great day.